Well, good morning, everyone. Darren Doherty is my name, and I'm here for another episode of Regrarians Talk, our mostly weekly program that we do on a Wednesday, Tuesday in other parts of the world. And today I'm really stoked to be able to sit face-to-face with the great Bruce Davison, who I've not met before, I don't think, although I've been down his way a few times, and wanted to check in with him on all of the stuff that he's got going on, because I've been an admirer from afar. I think we've shared this nefarious Facebook relationship, as so many of us do these days, and I thought it's about time we had a bit of a chat. So welcome, Bruce.
Good morning, Darren. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So the Bruce, you're in the south coast of New South Wales. People mightn't know where that is. You just describe the sort of part of the world that you're in.
Yeah, southeastern New South Wales, just north of the Victorian border. It's an area generally known as the Bega Valley. A lot of people know it from television ads for Bega cheese.
Yeah.
One of the big dairy companies in Australia. Semi-maritime environment, 800 mil rainfall zone. Unfortunately, the reliability and frequency of rain is not good. 800 mils is a good rainfall, but that falls typically in 2 or 3 events with very long periods of dry in between. So it is actually a brittle climate.
That's interesting.
Even though the rainfall doesn't suggest it.
Yeah, that's interesting. You describe it as brittle, although I know, having been there quite a lot in that part of the world and have had relatives there for a very long time, that it's one of those places where it gives all kinds of impressions of...
it certainly does. But that's how come we ended up here. The impression was good.
But then the droughts can be quite extreme, can't they?
Yeah, quite severe. Yeah, we typically, this is typical of our long-term rainfall. In the last 12 months, we've had our soil wet to 0.5 metre once, and it stayed wet for about 2 weeks, and by 3 weeks from that, we had moisture deficiencies, and that's all we've had in 2 years. There's been intermittent rainfall, but it's only been very small amounts. And we've just had 45 mils last Saturday, which was terrific rain, nice steady rain, but it was the first for 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And the month before that, I think we had about 15 mils.
Yeah.
So we're currently in drought. I think we've been here 14 years, and I'd say we've probably had three good years. One of those where we had reasonably good moisture year round. The rest of it has been, 600 mils of rain down to 350 in a really dry year.
It's interesting because it's we're having a conversation on the Regrarians Workplace at the moment that Robert Hollingsworth led off with about drought. And about words. Actually started off with words, and he's got about I think he's got about 80,000 acres that he shares with his brother outside of Charters, or inland from Charters Towers, and they've had some pretty significant droughts up there. And he's basically, as so many of us have talked about, painting the case that drought is actually the normal thing. Rain is the abnormal part of this.
Yeah, totally agree. That's the same here. I'm in drought preparedness mode, 365 a year. Always conscious of having at least 6 months feed up our sleeve, and we need it.
Yeah. So tell us what you're about. You're down in there in that lovely part of the world that's got beautiful impressions, the Sapphire Coast almost. It's got Bega.
It's a great part of the world.
It's got Bega cheese. The Bega cheese logo is all about green rolling fields and fecundity, and it's the fat of the land, of course, That's
Exactly.
So how do you get by, Bruce? What do you get up to down there, mate?
Well, we've got a relatively small farm, 380 acres.
Mm-hmm.
We run a self-replacing herd, and where we are at Candelo is the heart of the African lovegrass infestation area.
Mm-hmm.
And we've spent all of our time learning how to manage lovegrass rather than, I'm constantly researching how to remove it biologically. We have no intention of using poison. But we've bred through selective breeding, breeding on phenotype, we've bred a herd that can operate on lovegrass.
Mm.
And in the meantime, I've learned how to keep it in a reasonably digestible state. So lovegrass is a highly productive grass in the growing season. So we thought at the start, if we could learn how to utilise this, it grows for nothing because it likes degraded land, and all of this district is similar to much of Australia, highly degraded. If we could utilise it like a good stand of lovegrass, you're looking at 30 tonnes a hectare of dry matter. It's huge production.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't realise it was that high. That's incredible.
Yeah, I work on part-time on a lovegrass research project for local land services, and when we did our first veg surveys and we were sampling, taking biomass measurements, I think we got up to about 37 tonne a hectare was a old growth stand of lovegrass. Yeah, huge. So I learnt in the first big drought we had, I used to keep it short, the bulk of the farm short and actively growing, so it had high digestibility. But we went into a big drought, and I fortunately had about 6 paddocks that I hadn't slashed because we started out slashing it to keep it short. And those old long stands is what got us through the drought. Or we would have been in as much strife as everyone else who didn't have lovegrass was in serious strife. So I always try to maintain about half the farm long now. And that's what we've been grazing for the last 12 months.
So I've just a couple of things. I was in your part of the world years ago doing some lectures. Just trying to think
I was there.
Oh, you were there, right?
I did actually meet you then. Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. I know that we went to a few properties where there was some lovegrass trials going on.
That's the project I'm still working on.
Yeah, right. And I heard there was a few people there saying, "Oh, well, it's basically the game's over." The usual stuff that you hear when you've got this kind of successful organism. But it seemed like to me at the time it was a bit early to sort of call that because it's a bit of a long-term thing. But I was interested to hear from you. How has lovegrass changed? I mean, has it changed itself in terms of its productivity? Has it responded to your management of it?
Oh, it has. It's a highly plastic plant, so you can change it with fertility.
That's where I'm getting to. Yeah.
So where I'm fertilising, I went through trying to do it biologically. I was slashing it and then spraying worm juice on it. That improved its digestibility, and I did that for a couple of years. And when we first came here in 2004, Heidi came by and purchased the Alan Savory's Holistic Management book. And I grew up on a dairy farm, so I already knew that, or was familiar with the fact that wire grows grass. So when we bought this place, it only had 4 paddocks. And I think when we got hold of Alan Savory's book, we were up to about 20 or 25 paddocks. And we both read the book and studied it for about, we recognised it was a fairly complex book. We studied it for about 3 months each. So, and kept on fencing and to try and put higher grazing pressure on this lovegrass. All the while trying to find information, and we didn't have the internet then. to do research. And in those early days, I used to go to the library and source books, and there was very little information on it.
No.
However, or available information. It turned out once we got on the internet and got into Google Scholar, etc., because lovegrass is a worldwide problem.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of information. But during the course of this evolution of what we're doing here, I got into making compost. Because after a couple of years of doing the worm juice, I thought, well, this is probably working, but it's not changing the state of the soil. I'm only foliar feeding the plant.
Mm-hmm.
So this is going to be it.
You just grow more love
forever. Yeah. Well, making it a little bit more digestible.
Yeah.
We were keeping it fairly short. And then went off and did the opportunity came along to do holistic management training. And that was with Bruce Ward to start with.
Yep.
And we were in drought at the time and typically running short of feed, because at that stage I didn't realise that I really should be grazing it much harder than I was. And I've only really learned that in a couple of years from Graham Hand.
Mm-hmm.
Graham's idea of high utilisation and then long recovery, that has worked out to be a really good way to manage lovegrass.
That's interesting in itself.
Yeah, so what happened was we did this holistic management training, and then straight away we had a split mob, our breeders and our heifers. We used to keep all our heifers and grow them out because we had a self-replacing herd. Select the best of them, sell the rest, at joining time. So I went and bought some electric fencing and portable fencing. Mm-hmm. After doing that HM training, and put both mobs together and started putting high pressure on. And as I said, we were in drought. So immediately, and I was shifting 4 times a day.
Right.
Immediately I could see that was going to double our recovery period and increase utilisation. So that was a huge plus. We went from feed shortage to having more than enough just by doing that. However, I soon discovered that if I was shifting the cattle 4 times a day, 7 days a week, I wasn't going to be doing anything else. And we had a lot of development to do, tree planting, building, etc. So I thought, okay, well, this is probably good for grazing management, but not for whole of life.
No.
So I then went back to daily shifts just to have time to do other stuff. And then in the meantime, I started making compost. And I noticed that I built this compost heap on top of lovegrass, just 2.5 cubic meters of starter material. And by the time the compost was half done, all of the lovegrass around the compost heap had died within about a 3 meter radius. And up came ryegrass, prairie grass, clovers, medics. And that just happened naturally.
The fertility species.
Yes, exactly. See, lovegrass, 99% of the dry weight of lovegrass consists of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, all of which comes from the atmosphere. So it's got the same composition as a tree, which is why it's a low feed value. Yeah. Except when it's in early growth, just like a tree. I mean, a cattle will graze trees, but they only eat the leaves. They don't eat the woody parts. And the woody part is the bulk of lovegrass. Yeah. So you've got to keep it in a vegetative state. Anyway, turns out a bit later we had a visit from a university lecturer from Queensland University of Technology. I'm trying to think of her name. Can you remember her name, Heidi? Yeah. She's put about 10 years of research into lovegrass. She was down here for a talk on lovegrass at an event. Jennifer Fern, her name, but she's now an assistant professor. She came and visited us, and she was quite astounded at how our stock were eating lovegrass. And I'd just written an article. The Catchment Management Authority had asked me if I'd write something on lovegrass for farmers, because up on the Monero, they got a huge problem with love grass, and they were tearing their hair out. So they sort of wanted something. So I wrote this article on love grass, and when Jennifer Fern was here, she read it and she said, "Oh well, I believe you're correct." So it turned out that all of the research into love grass was how to get rid of it.
Mm.
The question I asked right from the start was, why was it here?
Mm.
If you know why it's here, then getting rid of it's much easier. So I'd worked out that it was here because of the lack of fertility. And so it seems that I was the first person that was able to identify that the mechanism that brought it here was the degradation of the soil.
Mm.
So if you restored fertility...
So that says to me, and I've seen this, and I know when I was there years ago, I don't know how long, I think it might have been in the fire shed. Was that event that you came
Correct.
to? Yeah, yeah.
Yep, Bucket Joe fire shed.
Yeah, that's the one. So, as we
Rod Logan had organised it with you, I think.
Yeah, yep, that's it. And there was another young fella there who was the love grass guy, and of course, he was taking the usual control type approach to things. It's always fascinating to me that so many of the times that the answers in all of this, or the pathway to answering this, is when you actually become an ecologist, which is what you did there, as opposed to being the control agent. Because good luck, and it seems to me also, Graham Handwood and I were talking about this recently, and I've had this conversation many times about a lot of people who are graziers don't actually understand grass. They understand cattle really well, and they understand fencing and marketing and all of that, but they don't actually understand grass. Can you speak to that a little bit in terms of how this has gone for you? Because it seems that you do understand it, because from how you've been talking.
Yeah, well, I during the course of trying to learn how to grow grass here, I went down the compost regime, went into Elaine Ingham's compost and compost tea workshop, and got pretty proficient at making compost tea. Like after I did the workshop, I came back and set up a brewer, and when I started making the tea, I was emailing them microscope photos every 4 hours of the brew as it progressed, and we were fine-tuning feed stuffs, etc., until they were satisfied that it was spot on. And then I started applying it, and I gave it a red-hot go for, well, probably 12 months, maybe a bit longer. Put a lot on, and it had absolutely no effect at all. Mm. There was no visual effect, and the cattle made, I tried doing strip spraying, no preferential grazing. And during the course of doing that, I started studying soil chemistry. And this was before I actually went off and did training with Neil Kinsey. We were in winter, we were brewing, I was brewing compost tea, protozoa tea, to drive nitrogen production, which was what Elaine had said. When to use protozoa tea, and there was this recipe we were using, which included lucerne. Put some lucerne in the brewer, and was taking 36 hours to brew. And after about the second brew of that, I emailed the lab. It wasn't Elaine, it was their Australian lab. And I asked them, we were having very regular conversations, email conversations, like 3 times a day, and they would answer within an hour.
Yeah.
And I'd said to them, and at that time they were using, they'd set up a business called Australian Biological Soil Supplies, and their opening page was a boundary photo of our farm. When I did the training with them, they asked, it was a 3-day course, and they asked if anyone had any boundary photos. Are any of you biologically farming? And I said, yes, I was, like using worm juice. And I put up this, I gave them this boundary photo, and they were quite impressed, and they used it as their opening page on their website for quite a few years. turned out once I got more knowledge that, it looked impressive, but it was just a timely photo. I'd slashed it. It started growing. I'd sprayed worm juice on it, and we got 3 inches of rain. Up it came. My neighbour had old growth love grass. Yeah, it looked wonderful, but it was smoke and mirrors. I was impressed at the time, which is why I took the photograph. I thought, this is really good.
But then you unpacked it, and
I unpacked it. Yeah. I was having a lend at myself, basically. So I asked this question of the soil food web. I said, "What is it about lucerne that produces protozoa?" And I didn't get a response, and I thought that's unusual. So I emailed them again the next day, saying, "You probably missed my email yesterday," and I asked them again. That was probably 5 years ago. I've never heard from them since.
Yeah, right.
And I thought at the time, maybe that was a touchy question. So I thought about it. I had my brewer going, and I thought, what is it? And so I knew that lucerne was high in protein, therefore it's high in nitrogen.
Nitrogen, yeah.
Yeah, so the next brew I made, instead of putting lucerne in, I made up a cocktail of fertilizer, conventional fertilizers, putting in the products that I knew our soil was deficient in, lime, calcium, magnesium, trace elements, including copper, and then I put in the biggest portion was urea. And I put all these trace elements and a bit of phosphorus, etc. And it was going okay. As soon as I threw the urea in, holy smoke, it just exploded in growth. And I thought, wow. And I didn't put a lot in. I just, I did some calculations on what I thought it would need.
So just to stop you there for a moment, Bruce, had you done, at this stage, had you done the Neil Kinsey training? And also, just for our listeners, people...
No, I hadn't at that stage.
People wouldn't know that Neil Kinsey wrote a great book called Hands-on Agronomy, and was a student of the late Dr. William Albrecht, who developed the Albrecht method. So please continue.
Yes, Neil's an Albrecht practitioner. So I'd already read Hands-on Agronomy, and as well as the Biological Farmer, I'd read.
You read everything. You read
Aaron Anderson's book.
I
had a pile of books a kangaroo couldn't jump over.
Yeah,
so I put this urea in, and I thought, wow, it just exploded in growth, and my brewing time went from 36 hours down to 4 hours.
Wow!
And the density of microbes was much higher than the basic brew. So what it meant was, instead of applying a brew every day and a half, I was able to put on 3 brews a day. Made a huge difference, not only to the amount I was able to put on, but also the cost of production. I did some calcs. If I was running my brewer all the time, it was like $250 a quarter just for electricity. And this cut it dramatically.
Yeah.
So, but soon after that, I realised the compost tea was doing nothing. Certainly not in this environment of African lumber.
Even so, you tested the use of using chemistry with biology quite directly in practice, and even then it did shorten the time of brewing, but even then the ultimate product didn't do what you wanted to do. No.
And soon after that, Neil Kinsey came to Australia, so I went and did his introductory course, and once I'd done that, pardon?
We must have missed each other there too.
Were you there?
Yeah. Over in, I did
Sale.
No, I didn't do the one in Sale. I did the ones in South Australia with the then ProAg,
right.
And I did his advanced. I did his advanced course over there at Roseworthy as well. That was
right.
When was that? In the late 90s?
Yep. Yeah. So I did it in 2013, I think.
Oh, okay. Might have been, right.
Yeah, something. Yeah, quite recently.
Right.
So I did. Or it might have been a year or two earlier than that.
Mm-hmm.
So once I did his introductory course, it was quite easy to work out why the compost tea wasn't going to work, because it just didn't have the volume of chemistry to make it any impact. It was a very, very minor foliar feed on the grass. So, and the following year I went and did his advanced course. And then after that, since that, I've developed my own program of what needs to be in the soil, optimum levels of nutrition. And this is how the Soilsmith thing came about. So I developed a spreadsheet based on cation exchange capacity, and as it rises. And when I did Neil's course, there's parts of it I thought, well, that makes it easy to do the calcs, but it can't be absolutely correct, because he'll for CEC from about 5 up to 18, I think it is, the base saturation percentage of calcium and magnesium are always 68-12.
Yeah.
And I realised that can't be totally correct, because as cation exchange capacity changes or rises, then the nutrient level, the nutrient holding capacity of the soil also rises. So it must be a gradual scale. It can't just be a straight line.
No.
Because from CEC 5 to 18, there's a huge difference in the capacity of the soil to hold nutrients. So I developed a spreadsheet, and since then my son's put it into an electronic form. So now when I run soil workshops, people get a USB, which they plug in, and it's got this program in it, and you just cut and paste your soil test into it, and you get an immediate reading of percentage availability and deficiency in kilograms per hectare. So from that you can immediately calculate your nutrient requirements, or fertilizer. So Neil had tried to make one of these, and he'd hired some engineers, computer engineers, to do it. He was telling us during the course, and they couldn't do it. And the DPI, and I've since found out, DPI in Victoria, in Tasmania, they put 3 agronomists on the job, and they spent 3 months trying to build one of these programs, and they gave up and said, no, it can't be done. So it turns out it can be done, and my son and I have done it, and I've now got it copywritten in 167 countries.
Oh, amazing!
And it's a fabulous program. You just copy and paste your soil test into it, and instant result.
So with that, just as an aside, when you say you copy and paste, well, one of the big things that Neil talks about is testing your tester. And this is from what I recall back, nearly 20 years ago when I did the workshops with him now. But testing your tester, and that not all soil tests are the same. So are you sort of pre-describing to people, or that they go with particular labs because of
I use EAL, and the program's written. It's test specific.
Yes.
You've only got to have one line wrong and it won't work.
Yes, that's what I mentioned.
So it's written for EAL. I have my own test with the EAL now called DAV006.
Yeah.
So which is the same. If you use NT001, which is Graham Sate's test, that one works in it too.
Right.
So but it'll work on any lab test, but you have to manually enter the numbers.
Yeah. Right.
For other labs.
Yeah.
And Neil said that he can't use other labs. He just uses the Perry lab.
Yes.
And his program, he can't get it to work with other labs. Well, I can, if someone sends me a soil test, providing the soil test identifies what the test is, not just the numbers, I can work with any lab and get a really good result. I've had people email me tests from other labs, and I give them a recommendation, and they come back later and say it was fabulous.
So you can use a Perry, an APEL, or even an Insight.
Anyone's.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, Incitec's fine.
Yeah.
But the issue with the Nutrient Advantage lab is that the data in the test is really good, but the way they report it is actually erroneous. If you've got an alkaline soil, an acidic soil, if the pH is 7 or above, their test is spot on. But in acidic soils, they've got some quite significant errors in there in the way they report it, because they don't include hydrogen in the CEC calculation or their base saturation percentages. So their base saturation percentages are wrong, and their CEC is wrong, because hydrogen's not a nutrient, but it's a cation.
Yes.
And the more acidic the soil, the more the hydrogen displaces the other cations.
Correct.
So, you can get a test from them and it might say the CEC is 8, when in reality it might be 10 or 11 if the soil's strongly acidic. And then they give calcium and magnesium as centimoles per kilogram. That's the way they report it. But you've got to convert that back to parts per million to know how much calcium is actually in the soil. And ironically, centimoles per kilogram, that figure they give, that's a calculation based on parts per million, so that they've already got the information, but they don't give it. So to use their test, you've got to be able to do some mathematics. You've got to understand the chemistry.
Yeah.
So
you got to unravel it again. It seems like there's a familiar,
unpack the test.
Yeah, there's a familiar theme here of unpacking, which is interesting, because you sound like to me the kind of farmer or the kind of producer who has always existed, and God help us will continue to exist, because you're interdisciplinary enough that, and obviously invested enough to go looking hard enough.
Yeah, I tell myself I suffer from the disposition that I have to know. I'm not happy with, yes, the grass grows. I want to know why it grows. Yeah, and that way I can control it or manage it.
Yes.
So when I came back from Kinsey's workshop, I went to my soil test, did some calcs, applied, got some fertilizer, put it on. The result was just stunning. Immediately, as soon as it rained, way everything went. Okay, and then from all of the trials, etc., I'd done, I then deduced that, okay, so the chemistry's got to come first. So I went back to the biology textbook and looked and read about the formation of life on this planet, and it states in there that the first organism that formed did so as a spontaneous reaction to chemicals. So therefore, the chemistry came first.
Yes.
Now, that was a simple carbon molecule that was able to replicate itself.
Yeah.
And from that evolved all of the more complex, higher order life forms. They all follow, and still do, follow the same nutritional pathway. And that is the chemistry has to come first.
Yeah.
So, when we want to grow an organism on the farm, whether it's soil microbiology or grass, we've got to have a chemistry in place. So when I looked at the soil chemistry, the soil biology rather, when I started putting fertilizer on, there's a truckload of people that say that fertilizer is bad for the soil, it kills microbes, etc. And I happened to be, one night I was got a phone call from Christine Jones. Christine, at that time, her and I used to, we'd email regularly, sometimes 10 times a night. And I got a call from her. We were doing lots of discussions on soils and pasture, etc. And she rang one night, and we were having this extended conversation. And I said to her, I just put a foliar on a paddock that I fertilised, and the foliar included copper at 3.5 kilos a hectare, copper sulfate. She was gobsmacked. She said, "You're going to kill all the fungi in the soil." And I thought, I didn't think so. I'd already done Kinsey's workshop, and I thought that's only half the copper that the soil is deficient. And spreading a small amount of copper on a area as copper sulfate solids is just about impossible. So I was putting it into solution.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so the next morning I thought I better go and have a look. So when I was
see how dead it was.
see how dead it was. So how dead the fungus was. So the fungi in the soil was. So and in the morning I had a look at my planner and I saw that I hadn't put 3.5 kilos on. I'd put 8.35 kilos on.
Oh.
So I was pleased I hadn't told her that. She would have fell off the phone. But which was only half of what was deficient. So I went out and got some soil samples, put them under the microscope, and I was astounded. The fungi had gone mad. Every field of view I had at least 3 species. Really, it was one of the best paddocks I'd had for fungi, and I thought,
which is kind of ideal in this sense, because a lot of people, I suppose, it's part of the narrative that because I've been through a sort of a similar pathway to you, except when I was doing the Kinsey stuff back in the late 90s and early noughties, working as a contractor, developing lots of people's properties, my whole pathway was go to APEL, get the test. And I did hundreds of tests, which I'll talk about later.
Yep.
And then went and did it all. But I didn't really see a lot of change. Perhaps that was because I wasn't the producer. Perhaps it was because I wasn't as connected to the landscape as I could have been. But what's interesting to me in this is that the pathway that we get to. And the narrative that I've sort of carried in now is that, this whole space is filled with what I call soil gods. You'll follow you're a Kinseyan, you're a Jonesian, you're
exactly. You're a site. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And so that may well stop you from continuing to pursue things. And so what's interesting with you in this case is that, all right, well, you follow the gods too, and you come out of that going, okay, all right, well, if I follow one god, which I have, and I've put out all this copper, the first thing I'm doing is going back and looking at I'm looking at the biology on top of the ground in terms of my livestock and my grasses. But then I'm also getting the microscope out, because you've already got that. And I think that's perhaps a rare thing in this space, that people are, again, feeling comfortable with looking at things from the different angles, as opposed to a Kinseyan would just look at it in one particular way, and someone who follows Ingham would follow would consider
exactly
it
with blinkers on. With blinkers on. I tried to, from all the reading I'd done, every book I read had some value in them. So I've tried to pull them all together and pluck out bits out of the whole lot and put together a recipe, because none of them are wrong, but none of them are completely right.
No.
So it's a bit like making a cake. You've got to get the recipe right, and then you've got to have the brewing in the oven right, the cooking. So which in the paddock you've got to have the moisture, etc. So I've tried to put it all together, and I've come up with a recipe that works really well. And a good way to describe it is I run soil workshops now after doing Kinsey's, because all these things cost a lot of money. And we've got a small farm that we can live on from the income of the farm, but there's no great surplus of cash. And when I did the advanced course with Neil, down at Sale, you got to travel there. There was 5 nights accommodation, food, etc. It had $3,000-4,000, and to recover the cost. And the same was when I did soil food webs. Course, I did the same thing afterwards. I started teaching it because I'd learned a long time ago the best way to learn a subject is to teach it.
Yes. Because
in order to teach it, you've really got to train yourself.
Yes.
And so I used to teach making compost and compost tea, and still do occasionally. And then I started running soil workshops. And so I ran this soil workshop about 3 years ago now. And my daughter, who has a small farm, she's always in my ear, what do I do, Dad? Da-di-da. And I said, this workshop's near you. Come to this workshop and you can do it yourself then, because I train people to do it themselves.
Sure.
And then just offer them support. Well, after this workshop, my daughter said to me, Shelley, she said to me, who was that guy that was really sort of antagonistic? Because these are one-day workshops. And I said, well, I don't know him, never seen him before. And he was sort of really in my ear of whether or not I was right. So, but it turned out a week later, he phoned me because this workshop was first of a series of 3 over 18 months because this Lenke group had gained some funding to do some trials, paddock trials. So he phoned me, this farmer phoned me a week later and asked me if I'd go up and do soil testing on his place. So I did. And he had planted a multi-species crop, including perennial ryegrass and cocksfoot and clovers, etc., trying to revive a paddock. And he'd been working on it for 3 years with a local agronomist. And he was having pretty poor headway. And he said to me when we were in the paddock, the last time we got the agronomist out, the agronomist said, well, you've done everything I've said, you've just got to wait for it to grow. And it wasn't happening. So this guy was in a nervous state of haste. He wanted it to happen. And he said, can you fix it up? And I said, sure, we'll do a soil test. And I did a test. And as we were walking around the paddock, I pointed out to him all the deficiencies that were obvious in the plants. So I gave him a recipe and worked out at about $650 a hectare, which is a fairly typical cost to start getting a degraded paddock going. And he said to me at the time, he said, I've spent a lot of money on the paddock. He said, this is fairly expensive. How long do you think it'll take to work? And I said, 10 days. You put it on, within 10 days of raining, you'll see the difference. Well, he put it on, and when it rained, which was in March, 1st of March, it started raining. And I think he got about 3 inches of rain. And he phoned me 3 weeks later, and he said to me, it didn't take 10 days, it only took 5. He said it's just totally exploded in growth. And he said, I want you to come in a couple of weeks' time and test it again because I want to have it spot on for spring to make hay or silage from it. I said, yeah, righto. So, and it was growing like steam. So 6 weeks after that rain arrived, I retested the paddock to get it, fine-tune it for spring. And what was really incredible was the increase in soil carbon. The plants were really firing and pumping a huge amount of carbon into the soil. And that soil had a rate of carbon increase of 345 kilograms per hectare per day over that 6-week period. That was the average. Which was 45
kilos of carbon per hectare per day.
Organic carbon per hectare per day. Huge. Which meant that the plants were really pumping a lot of exudates into the soil, you know. And as Christine Jones says, that the rate of root exudation is determined by the photosynthetic capacity and the photosynthetic rate of the plant.
Yeah.
So clearly, if the plant's got optimum nutrition, it's going to be performing at its best. And its nutrition is chemistry. So we had fine-tuned this paddock, and this pasture, the crop, if you like, there were quite a few annuals in it. It had just exploded into growth. It was really impressive. And this fellow runs stud cattle, and he does a lot of showing, and he used to spend a lot of money on hay to keep them in good condition over winter for the spring showing season. And you know, a year later, and it turned out he owned 2 farms, and because a year later he wanted me to go and do his other farm, and he said that his cattle had never been in better condition, and he never fed a single bale of hay that winter, because when we fixed that paddock up, unbeknown to me, he'd done the next 4 paddocks as well.
Oh, okay.
And we'd walk through them, and he asked me if the soil's the same, and I said, yeah, this there was a lot of a ridge. I said, this whole ridge has got the same soil. And so he did the whole 4 paddocks, and that got him through. And he didn't have to buy feed. But also, interestingly, within 6 months, his neighbour phoned me. And I get this quite often now. His neighbour phoned me and said, oh, you did Joe's paddock? And I said, yes. And he said, can you come and do my farm, please? Because he's watching over the fence.
Yeah.
And I get that quite often now. Within 6 months, the neighbour will phone me. And I go and do theirs as well. So I don't advertise my service. It's just word of mouth. If it doesn't work, then my phone doesn't ring.
Yes.
But my phone's pretty busy.
So when you say,
and also,
so when you go, does that mean people, you actually physically go out, or do you instruct them how to?
Yes. Yeah. No, I go out and take the samples myself, talk to them. I need to know what their ambitions are. And I do a bit of farm planning and paddock subdivision advice, etc. Look at the whole farm planning.
Yeah.
If they want it, then I'll do a plan of their farm and suggest where they should have their fences.
Yeah.
Because a lot of these properties might only be 6 paddocks.
Yes.
And 6 paddocks, you're limited to how much grass you're going to grow.
Yeah. That's very interesting.
And they get that.
What's interesting?
So that's been
go on.
So that's been the journey into the fertilizer use. I find it really, really intriguing that people put up statements. Nowadays we're in the age of communication, which I'm absolutely stoked that I'm living through this. That you can Google search any stuff, but you can have real live conversations with people anywhere in the world. And people will put up stuff that fertilizer kills soil biology, and they started working on a soil that was biologically dead, and it's impossible to have a biologically dead soil. If there's no plants, the soil can be bare and rock hard, but it's not biologically dead. You cannot kill the microbes in soil. Some scientists doing research tried, this is a couple of years ago, I read this, they were trying to sterilize some soil of microbes to do some specific research, and they autoclaved it for at 120 degrees for 3 hours, and they still couldn't kill all the microbes in it. So, you can pick up a piece of rock hard, seemingly dead soil and do a microbial extraction, and it's more than just something. There's still a lot there. So anyway, these conversations bandy around, and I think, well, clearly the people who make those statements have the blinkers on. They're going down this one track, the E-lane track or whatever it is, and they can't. They've lost their peripheral vision. And so I quite often jump in and say, they'll quote research that says, nitrogen has burnt all the carbon, burnt a lot of carbon out of the soil. And when I read the research they put up, and the researchers only applied nitrogen. Well, if you apply nitrogen to soil, a nitrogen fertilizer, you can be pretty much guaranteed that you're going to burn soil organic carbon at the rate of 11 to 1. 11 kilos of carbon will go for every kilo of nitrogen you put on. But put that same amount of nitrogen on in a balanced fertilizer regime and you build carbon. You do the opposite, because then the plants can properly function. So I've been having an interesting conversation on this with Jamie Elizondo Braun. Because I'm a great admirer of his grazing skills. And we've been talking about using urea as a foliar. Terrific for growing grass and for building soil carbon. Like Jamie had said in a conversation, I think with someone else, that urea burns humus. And I thought, well, that's not right. So I jumped in and said, no, that's not correct. It can do, misused. But if you use it correctly, it does the opposite. It builds humus. Because nitrogen is essential, and it doesn't matter really what form it's in, but as urea is an organic form of nitrogen, and if you use it as a foliar, then it's going on as a primary amine, and the plant then doesn't have to convert nitrate into amino acid in order to produce protein. It's already got the amino nitrogen from the urea. So, a plant uses 17% of its photosynthetic energy for that conversion of nitrate to amino acid. If the plant gets the nitrogen as a foliar, as an amine acid, amine nitrogen, then that 17% of energy it can put into growth.
Yes.
And that's before the effect of the support of nitrogen. So you get a huge increase in growth and root exudation that comes with it, providing you've got all the other nutrients in place. So where was I going with that? This conversation with Jamie. Yeah, so I gave him a recipe because he was interested for doing a foliar of urea. It has to go on with a humate to make it work well. I've gone off on a tangent there.
That's okay.
lost the plot.
So this was a conversation that was being held in the Regrarians workplace, which I've been sort of sitting back and watching unfold, which has been really interesting.
Yeah.
Well,
see, that's right. And people have this view that fertilizer is, because this research says the use of nitrogen has reduced carbon in the soil, they then say, well, all synthetic fertilizer is bad. Mm-hmm. So they just put the blinkers on. That stuff's no good. And almost invariably, when I read the research papers, they've only applied nitrogen on its own. And in that recent conversation, someone quoted the Morrow Fields, 50 years of research and the loss of soil carbon with this fertilizer use. But the photo they put up shows that a highly cultivated soil. Now, it's been cultivated for half a century. There's no surer way to lose carbon out of soil than cultivation.
Oxidization,
just it oxidizes, So, the research paper didn't mention cultivation.
No.
But it was all focused on the fertilizer. And I thought, these guys are PhDs. And I've learnt over the years that I've corrected a hell of a lot of PhDs in recent years who make statements that are profoundly wrong because they're writing in or talking about subjects they're not proficient in.
So this is again symptomatic of what I said before, that people like you who are poly, not mono,
yes.
polysaturated, not monosaturated.
Yes, yeah.
That's a broader issue in this space, is that Savory makes the same accusation that a lot of people who are dissing holistic management are coming at it from one particular angle, because that's what science does. Science is ultimately reductionist.
Yes. I think whatever the subject is we're focusing on, and we know agriculture is highly complex. We have to have a holistic view. I mean, Alan Savory nails it when he's talking about grazing. The soil's got to be a part of that holistic view, and nutrition for the soil and for the plants has got to be a holistic view. And it just came back to me then what I'd forgotten earlier in our conversation with Jamie, and I went back to his opening statement about the fertilizer not being good for the soil, and I said, well, saying fertilizer is detrimental to soil is exactly the same as saying livestock are detrimental to the land.
Yes.
I mean, there's a huge amount of evidence globally that soils have been degraded through pastoral farming. And it's clear. Cattle and sheep have really degraded the land. But as Alan Savory points out, the problem is not the cattle or the sheep. It's not the animals. The problem is the manager of the animal. So we know that grazing animals can seriously degrade land, but they can also very rapidly repair it under the holistic plain grazing regime, like Jamie is expert at. And so fertilizer is the same thing. If you don't use it correctly, you have a poor outcome. Use it correctly, and the outcome is the opposite. We've been running some research, which on our farm here. About 6 years ago, Heidi and I won a Gaia Award from Christine Jones. Gaia stands for Green Agriculture Innovation Award, and with it came a check for $5,000, which we thought great. I was going to buy a new high-powered energizer and some more electric fencing with it, and Heidi suggested. She said, why don't we invest it for 5 years and use the interest to run an annual field day? And I said, oh, that's a brilliant idea. So we did. It only produced about $270 interest a year. But that's enough to put on a lunch or something. So we decided we'd hire the town hall, and I'll just take you through the evolution of this 5-year annual field day, because it evolved into something really, really interesting about soil. So we hired the town hall, $130 or whatever it was, and I'd gone into town and saw the local ag supplies place to see if they would do some financing for the cost of food, which they did. They come on board for 5 years, paid the cost of food, and another organisation, Gosh Seaweed Concentrates, they supplied the cost of food for morning tea and afternoon tea. The local ag big Southern Farm Supplies and Bega supplied the funding for the lunch. Heidi did all the food preparation, and then we hired someone to give her a hand for the preparation and delivery on the day, etc. And it all worked out pretty well. Idea was we'd bring in some keynote speakers, go and have a look at what we're doing on the farm. If people were interested, they'd come, etc. So the first year, Christine came and gave a talk on nitrogen, and we had what's his name from New Zealand, the author of Visual Soil Assessment.
Oh yes.
Gee, his name's just gone straight out of my head. He came. Well, he emailed to register for the field day. It was obvious he wanted to come and talk to Christine. So
Graham Shepherd.
Graham Shepherd, yes.
Yeah,
so
sorry,
Graham
I'm using Google.
Emailed, I said, yeah. I figured you're doing that. Thanks. A fabulous book. Anyway, Graham registered, and so I emailed him and said, look, seeing you coming, how about giving a presentation in the paddock, do a visual soil assessment demonstration? He said, yeah, great. And I said, bring your books, you can sell your books, etc. Yeah. He ended up selling about $1,000 worth of books because we had 80 people rolled up. So he did okay out of it. So that first year we had Christine and Graham, and it was really successful. So the following year I thought, what do we do? And I put in a pasture crop of oats into lovegrass. I thought this will. I'd met Colin Seiss a few years earlier. We'd chatted a few times, and I thought I'll give this a go because Colin is, he's a real innovator.
He is.
Yeah, and this worked really well. So and I got Peter. Second year, I got Peter Norwood. Don't know if do you know Peter Norwood?
Peter Norwood.
He's an agronomist from Mafra.
Oh yeah.
Albrecht practitioner.
Right. Yep.
He came up. He's a very good presenter on the relationship between human health and soil. Mm-hmm. So he came and gave a presentation that year, and we came and had a look at this pasture crop, and he gave quite a good paddock talk because he's very good at identifying nutritional deficiencies just by observing the plant.
Yes. And
at the end of that day, he said to me, "Why don't we do a trial? Next year we'll put this in with an full Albrecht system, and he would do the recommendations." I said, that's a good idea. And I thought about it for a bit, and then I thought, well, that's only good if we got something to compare it to. Mm-hmm. So I went and seen the local agronomist, and I said, would you be prepared to come and take if I set a land aside and reasonable sized plot, I'll have one. Peter Norwood's got one. We'll have one for a control. Would you be interested in doing the other one? And we'll, because the idea was that we'll see if we can work out the fertilizer requirements to lift fertility sufficient to get rid of lovegrass and come up with the most economic method to do it. Mm-hmm. And this agronomist, who turned out to be a very good agronomist, said, yeah, sure. So that first year we had a control, two agronomists, the local one and Peter Norwood and myself, doing our own stuff. And the control. And at the end of in spring, before the field day, I took soil samples and leaf analysis, had them analysed because I wanted to look at the nutrients within the crop as well. It was not just about growing the most grass; it was quality as well.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, and what I expected, the control, the soil degraded quite noticeably. Carbon was lost. Fertility was lost because we grew this crop and didn't put anything in. Now, in hindsight, if photosynthesis alone was going to regenerate the soil, why didn't it happen? Because we didn't spray out this paddock and plant. We planted into a living pasture.
Yes.
And so there was more than one species there. And the three plots had their varying differences. I used an organic fertilizer plus conventional. The other, Peter Norwood did the full Albrecht, and the other agronomist did an NPK. Mm-hmm. And the other agronomist actually worked out to have the second best result of the whole lot. And year two, I managed to get another agronomist interested. Because we couldn't expand the site, I gave the other agronomist the control plot. Mm-hmm. Because it was clear that the control plot was just going to continue to degrade, and inform them what had happened on that plot.
Well, you could say the world around you is the control plot, isn't it?
Well, of course, yes, indeed, yeah. And it shouldn't be necessary to inform the person of the history. They should be able to find that out in soil tests, because you're dealing with what you've got at the moment.
Yes.
Except if lime has been put on in the last 3 years, then you need to know that.
Yeah.
But that other agronomist the following year applied urea on its own. Planted with no. They considered the soil was sufficiently fertile and they did their own. I did baseline testing and then annual testing of each plot and sent them all the copies, but they did their own individual testing using their own labs, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. and as well. And I was doing the testing for monitoring, and plot one, which was the originally the control, this fellow put on no starter fertilizer, 100 kilos a hectare of urea in spring, and 2 weeks later another 100 kilos a hectare, and that's all he put on. Mm-hmm. Whereas the other plots had a starter fertilizer and then a more balanced spring application. Well, that year, the loss of carbon from plot one was huge. And I said to the agronomist involved, you should have known that. Putting N on its own, and the calculations were almost spot on, 11-1. Because, soil, the carbon nitrogen ratio of soil should be in the range of 10 to 12-1 is the ideal range, and mid range is 11, and so he put on 92 kilos of N, and he lost over 1,000 kilos of
wow.
C. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So at the other end of the scale, I'd put on a blend of organic and inorganic fertilizers. I used 100 kilos of urea as well in spring. My carbon levels went up profoundly. So you can use nitrogen and build carbon. It doesn't burn the carbon, but you've got to have it in balance. Mm. So I was really pleased this other agronomist had come in and decided to use N on its own, because then we'd done our own trial of using N on its own, and sure enough, just like the textbook said it would do, it did. That was a big lesson for all of us, including the agronomists.
No doubt.
And the costs per plot were quite high, but the profits were even higher. It was very cost effective, and some of the plots were, well, Peter Norwood's one at the start, because being an Albrecht, he wanted to correct everything at day one.
Yes.
That was $1,900 a hectare.
Yes.
I mean, think of that on a broad acre scale. Huge, but it was still profitable. It made more money than it cost. Mm-hmm. And we evaluated it as a hay crop being cut and baled by a contractor and sold at market price for bulk hay.
And
And you know, the sale price, oaten hay, I use $250 a tonne. But, you know, the best plot, I also, aside from these 4 plots nearby, I also did a multi-species planting of 27 species into a perennial pasture. That turned out to be the best by a small margin. That produced about 14 tonnes a hectare of hay.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, that's a return of about $3,500 a hectare at $250 a tonne.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the cost was just over, it was about $1,100 a hectare. So it was highly profitable. And left the soil in better condition than when it started. So I had intended doing some more pasture cropping this year, but you know, the seed drills hasn't moved because it's been dust dry. I learned from quite a few years ago not to plant into dry soil because if it doesn't rain, you know, the fertilizer's still there, but you know, the seed will germinate with a shower and then it'll die.
Mm.
The seed in Australia is very expensive compared to, say, America.
Yeah, there's a lot of issues in all of that, which is really interesting. One thing I'd make a point of is I think your, let's say, your intellectual ally in all of this would be a great friend of mine in Abe Collins, who I don't know if you've ever corresponded with Abe.
I've heard of him.
Yeah.
I've heard of him.
Yeah, yeah, and he's similarly disposed, I might say to you.
Right, similar disposition.
Yeah, yeah. He started off the. I first met Abe when he'd started off the world's first carbon farmers program in the United States, which was called the Carbon Farmers.
Oh, right.
In the mid-90s. In the mid-noughties, and I did a keyline workshop. So he was a keyliner, but he's also across a lot of what you've talked about, and in his prescriptions for soil management, his process is very, very similar to your own. I think as a practitioner, again, a dairy farmer, so he's come from that space, being a dairy farmer, and dairy farmers, perhaps, well, people who, I know you're not a dairy farmer now, but one of the things about dairy farmers is that they've got the capacity to monitor holistically, probably better than any other producer, because they've got daily feedback. In fact, sometimes twice.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you've got
twice daily feedback.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly. So you've got the feedback in the animal, you've got the feedback in the grass, because most dairy farmers are doing strip grazing or something like that. So they've got that on.
And they've got the analysis in the vat.
They've got the analysis in the vat. They've got the analysis when they do their biological testing of the milk and so on. So there's, so that's why dairying is such a full-on game. Now, so that's interesting from one perspective. And Abe and I have continued to work together for nearly the better part of 15 years or so now. So, which is great. Now, one thing that strikes me in this, and it was interesting that in terms of the capital cost recovery, because the way I've looked at fertilizers, and it was similar to what you were talking about before with who's the gentleman in Peter, who did Peter Norwood from Gippsland.
Oh, Pete Norwood, yes.
In that and this is the blowback that I was getting back in the 90s with the Albrecht stuff, was that we were working with some soils which had CECs of 40 and were lime deficient. And you looked at the total capital cost, and it was kind of like we were going, it was a similar amount of lime that we would require, say, to what you would need to grow truffles. But we weren't. We were growing grass, which is not quite as valuable as, it's not $250 a tonne that you're getting back for truffles, right? So it started to get really expensive. So I'll just park at that one point, and that was a big resistance to us continuing. The other thing that sort of started to remark upon me, and this is I think an important discussion when it comes to, let's say, the whole physics of global warming and all of the rest of it, is that if we are to use ammonia, or if we're to use urea, well, then urea is produced using natural gas, using the Haber-Bosch process. Now, I've not been able to find the amount of natural gas that goes into making a kilo of urea. I do know it for how much it is for making ammonia. So, like anhydrous ammonia, it takes about and I've just got the figures here from an article I wrote years ago. It takes about 1,000 cubic meters of natural gas to produce 711 kilos of ammonia, right? So if the average, and this is, I'll just quote from my article here. So if it takes 1,000 cubic meters of natural gas to produce 711 kilos of ammonia, then the average US corn crop uses the equivalent of 2,000 to 5,009 kilo bottles of natural gas per acre, per hectare, per crop. And so I think you can see where I'm getting to here is that you can get carbon gain, but at what cost in urea? So for my thinking here is that I don't have a problem with using urea at all if it gets you a gain, but at what point do we actually step off that urea train? That's the one. That's the first thing.
We'll come back to that.
Because that's one of the issues with this in terms of, and it's like the use of capital in anything. When you look at it through the savoury lens again, where you're looking at in your testing decisions, one of the decisions you're making is around energy and money use. Are you using this all the time? Is it creating a sort of an addictive behaviour, or is it something that's quite a capital cost, which then through management because we all came to these.
You paid interest.
Well, we came to these landscapes as Europeans or as our brown brothers before with an amount of natural capital which has been drawn down on. What we're looking at with this proposition is, all right, well, we've got our situation. We're going to put on chemical capital, right? That's using money capital to do it. Yes, it gives us a profitable outcome, but at what cost? And do we need to stay on that train? So now I don't know in the narrative if you wanted to kick onto that now or with as part of it.
I will. And just in case we lose it. I'm asked this question repeatedly when I'm doing soil workshops. Farmers, usually get a bit excited that they can have a real outcome from inputs, because it seems to be human nature that we really like putting stuff into our farm. It makes us feel good. And fertilizer is no exception. But the question I get asked is, once we start this, do we have to do this every year?
Yes.
And it's a valid question. And my stock answer is, if you do it correctly, no. If you don't, yes. So if you use the fertilizer to build up soil fertility, once you've got that fertility there and functioning, mostly I'm dealing in pastoral systems. If you then apply the correct grazing management to recycle sufficient back to the soil to feed the soil microbes so they can mineralize at least or more than you've just extracted, then the fertility remains and you no longer need to add fertilizer. And it won't be put a heap on and that's the end of it. You correct it and then slowly taper off as you learn how to manage. So, sustainability in a grazing system is where the amount you extract is replaced biologically through mineralization. If you're able to feed your soil microbes to mineralize more than you just took off, then your operation is regenerative and you'll build fertility. And if you took off more than you're able to regenerate, then your soil degrades. That's how it functions biologically. So the key is you've got to feed the microbes, and the microbes have the same diet as plants, which is chemistry. They decompose organic material to get at the chemistry.
Yes.
They don't particularly want to eat a dead plant root.
Just like we eat
but they
potatoes.
want what it contains.
Potatoes taste good, but the underlying, they're just a chemical package. They're a tasty,
exactly.
Tasty package for chemistry is what you're getting to.
Yeah, and our food's the same. We decompose in our gut to get the chemistry out of it.
Yeah, yeah.
So, if providing we get the grazing right, so that we can feed enough back to the soil, like a cow returns 85% of what it eats back to the land. And if you can, the reason Jamie gets such good results is he's got really high density, and all that urine and manure is being put back from the same land it came from. So he's got this feedback loop. Like in nature, no one was out putting out fertilizer.
No.
But there was a 100% feedback loop. No one was taking anything away until humans came along and had to take a harvest. Even with big grazing herds moving through, those animals were living and dying on that land. And there was a 100% feedback loop. So the soil biology was constantly being fed. And we come along with extractive agriculture, and we need to take a yield because we've got to make a profit. That yield is chemistry. So, and we didn't understand that we'd interrupted this feedback. And so we started running down nutrients, including carbon, and the soil becomes degraded. So, the high density grazing system restores that feedback loop. And as soon as you restore that and you start building carbon, it's a naturally supporting system, because for every gram of carbon you put in the soil, it'll hold 8 grams of water. And water is the key to making it function. So you've got to have a very high...
What about the nitrogen part of this, though? So,
there's a huge amount of nitrogen in soil. For every 1% of organic...
78% of what we're breathing is nitrogen right now. Correct,
yeah. If you look at at the top 10 centimetres of soil, which is where most of the nutrient for plants is obtained, for every 1% of soil carbon, for every 1% of soil carbon, there is 1,200 kilograms a hectare of organically bound nitrogen. And the rate of mineralisation is between 1% and 5% per year. So, and that's controlled by water. If you've got year-round moisture and non-brittle in climates where you've got not necessarily high rainfall, but you've got regular rainfall, microbes are functioning all the time. So for every 1% of carbon in the soil, you're getting 60 kilograms a hectare of nitrogen, plant available nitrogen produced. 2% of carbon with year-round mineralisation produces 120 kilos. 120 kilos happens to be the ideal amount to have in your soil all the time. So when you get carbon levels up around 10%, there is an enormous amount of nitrogen being produced, even when you don't have year-round moisture. And as you probably know, in Australia, before we started, the organic matter in our soils was extremely high. Australia had very fertile soil.
There's
lots of comment nowadays.
Paul Strzelecki's findings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Up to 35%.
Yeah.
Organic matter. And 15 to 20% was very common. Well, once I've found in through years of looking at soil tests that in a non-brittle climate, once you get past 15% organic matter, there's, generally speaking, no fertilizer required. That seems to be the tipping point, providing you have moisture. And then you're not mining the farm for its nutrients, if you understand the feedback required. So 15%, which was standard in Australia, is just doesn't exist anymore. So Australia had these rich soils, and when they first started cropping here, fertilizer wasn't required. Grew stunning crops, matching European standards, but only on year one. And it only took about 6 or 7 years for the crop to fail. And it was just a downhill slide. We didn't understand that we were mining the soil. Because we didn't have the rainfall that we had in Europe and come from, we didn't understand this process of mineralization. And so the soil just fell to pieces. Was basically, a cliche, it was mined to death. But,
the proposition, therefore, is, and this is where I started my question, is that from your perspective, your program, or where you've come to with all of this, is that we need to come in and do it. We need to do a little bit of capital improvement. We need to get things back. We need to use the chemistry to get the biology going. It's not the other way around, because that's a different narrative that's out there. But we need to do that. Some of that may be artificials, because some of that will be the sort of the punch in the arm. And that's not that different to what P.A. Yeoman said 60 years ago, where he said, you're using a small amount of super, which has got the nitrogen, whatever, to get things going, to kickstart things. But it'll probably be less than, this is his thing, it'll probably be less than what you're otherwise using. You're saying, well, let's, with your findings now, we have the Albrecht tests, we have all of this stuff. Let's use this good knowledge. Let's go and put on the amount, and then let management take over. The next step from that, though, is that and you touched on this just then, is that agriculture is still by nature an extractive industry, in that those animals don't live and die on our farms, right? They go there.
No, they don't.
No, right? And that's something that I'm quite passionate about. And I know that people like Michelle Lally and Phil Lally have just won the Meat and Livestock Australia Innovator Award. We took them on a tour of Mike Calicrate's property in Kansas years ago. I've been very passionate about on-farm processing and so on, because where you're seeing a huge organism go off a property, I equate, and I'd like to get your opinion on this, I'd equate muscle mass to basically being sunlight, because there's not a lot of nutrition in muscle. But I equate the rest of the carcass in terms of its bones as being a mineral, blood as being where all the nitrogen is, because the biological oxygen demand levels of blood is about 10,000 times higher than any other body part of an animal. So blood has a biological oxygen demand of about 200,000 milligrams per litre, whereas manure is about 2,500 milligrams per litre. So its potency, which stands to reason, is much higher, right? So you've got these components which are in themselves minerals in animation, which are moving off your property. How much of an offload is, or how much of a download from the property are we getting there? And is that a fundamental issue that we have in this space that I think from a policy perspective, we should be, like, for me, I think my ideal regenerative farm is where the animal dies on the property, all it leaves is the viscera. Everything else that's hard, and even the blood, should stay, because that's where you get your potency back to the land. And Mike,
totally agree with that.
Mike Calicrate's the only person I work with that sort of cracked that, because I said to him, well, look, because we sort of unpacked his whole program, and because Mike's unique, he's got a on-farm processing plant, and he owns the whole value chain. So he's got his own shop in town. He's got his own bone. He hangs his animals for 28 days. He's got his own boning room, and he's got his own retail outlet. So he's rare in that sense. And I said to him, what about the bones? What's that? Because he's got this mountain of bones. And he said, I said, what are you doing with them? And I said, why don't you burn them like Hyro Restrepo does and get the phosphorus recovery? Anyway, he said, so he ended up charring them instead, making pine char. And we did the test on it, and it had the same analysis as super.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
It's fascinating. I'll send you the results. We got them done through Logan Labs.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and so he's now got a phosphorus recovery program, right?
Yep.
And calcium, because the bones...
And calcium, yeah.
Yeah, but it's completely soluble, because we put those tests through a soil analysis, which is all about soluble mineral availability. So I went to that and I went, gee, well, what about the blood? What about the guts? What about this? What about that? What? Because they're the bits that aren't being consumed. And I thought, well, gee, we're missing out on a lot. So I've spoken for a while there. I just wanted to get your
that's fine.
It's the same on milk, veggies, like selling hay off a property, or when you're selling stuff in a vegetative state. Like they say, you shouldn't sell off your farm what can't walk or fly off, because it's what's walked and flown as you pointed out, done some poo along the way, done some poo and poo. So at least it's had its cycle, whereas veggies or leaf matter doesn't. So that milk doesn't. So how do we play that game? In that, when we talk about regeneration and we talk about sustainability, how do we play that?
Well, Well, I think it needs to be dumbed down, so it's easily understood. And I think otherwise it gets too complex and people just walk away from it. And I think the simplest way to understand it is that to know that, right, if 85% of what a cow eats goes back to the land, she retains 15%. So when you sell an animal off the land, you have to work out the mineral contents because for every tonne you haven't got 150 kilos of minerals, because a lot of that weight is water.
Yes.
So you have to work out the dry weight of the animal, and that's the mineral content that's leaving, and that becomes pretty complex. Much easier just to do an annual soil test and look at your carbon levels. If you can maintain carbon, then you're maintaining your nutrient level in your soil. If it's staying the same, then your feedback loop is matching, or your mineralization is matching your export.
So you're saying,
and if it's not, that's an early warning.
The carbon is basically the arbiter of all of this. It's the canary.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because that also controls water, and water is required for mineralization. So carbon is a key to monitor, and it also simplifies it. When I get a soil test, a repeat soil test from farms I'm consulting on, first thing I look at is the level of carbon, and if that's going up, then we're on the right track. I know that his fertility is rising. And that's where we have to...
It's going to say, all right, because if it's going down, then you're going to go, or you're going to point your finger at something to say, like, oh, you're just using urea by itself, or you're using super by itself.
Well, not necessarily. Not necessarily.
Or it's going to be cultivation, overgrazing.
Well, yeah, he could be a take-all grazier. And I always explain to them, if you take all when you're grazing, you can expect to be using fertilizer every year, and probably increasing amounts, not decreasing. You've got to graze in a manner that you're returning something to the soil. It doesn't have to be litter. You've got to, you might be putting it back into the soil as root exudate, which means you don't want to take more than perhaps half the leaf off when you're grazing, so that the plant's continually photosynthesizing. There can be exceptions. If you want to finish cattle and get weight onto them, then you need to graze the grass down low, because the top half of the grass is full of energy. That's where the photosynthesis is taking place. The bottom half is where the protein is. That's what's going to put muscle into your animals. So, if you want to put finishing weight on cattle, you should be grazing your paddocks hard.
Because you want both,
right down.
you want both muscle and fat.
Yes, yeah. And then those paddocks have got to be able to recover from that. And you only do that for maybe 3 months, just to put the finish on your cattle before you market them. If you grow cattle out, if you're selling store calves, you don't have to do that. And so if you don't graze more than 50% of the leaf, then the plant's photosynthesizing all the time, continually putting carbon into the soil, and providing it's got the right nutrition, it'll be pumping a lot of carbon into the soil, and you'll be building carbon all the time. But if you're a take or set stocker, the plant's never going to be able to build soil carbon. And so it doesn't matter how much fertilizer you put on. The end result's going to be you're going to have to use the same or more the following year.
Yeah.
So you've got to understand the process.
Your hydroponic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So once people can get their head around the fact that the best and most efficient way to build carbon in the soil is through photosynthesis, then all you have to do then is manage the health of the plant so it can photosynthesize at the highest capacity and rate as possible. And so you're just managing that drawdown, if you like, from CO2 into the soil. And grazing is just a consequence of managing that, and that's where you get your financial return.
Yeah. So what about with other products such as when you've done soil testing and you've looked at dairy properties and you've looked at vegetable properties? I'm assuming you've worked on some other types of production systems. Have you found any of those require more in terms of management and input than others?
No. Well, vegetable growing will require more because it's take-all farming.
Yeah.
Unless they are
and it's cultivation based. And it's cultivation.
Yeah. I mean, cultivations, you can get away with cultivation providing you're producing enough photosynthesis to restore what you've just damaged. That typically doesn't happen in horticulture.
No.
And veggie growers, if you're conscious and you put in a cover crop, if you like, between harvest crops and restore fertility that way, you can do that. Otherwise, you've got to do it with fertilizer. And I find the nutrient requirement for all crops is exactly the same, whether you're growing grass or you're growing vegetables. And I got an email from someone down in Wangaratta about 3 years ago, horticulturalist, veggie grower, moderate to large, not large scale, but commercial. And they'd been working with another lab and weren't getting very good results, and asked me for some advice. And I said, well, send me your soil test, and they did. And so I said, well, this is one lab that I don't like, and I don't know if I should name it, but I just tell them don't use that lab. They're 4 times the cost. Put out a 9-page report, of which there's only 1 page with useful information. The rest of it's just it looks wonderful.
And with P?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
That's the one, yeah. But the reason I don't like them is they use the wrong phosphorus test. They use Olsen. And most of our soils are acidic. And the Olsen test was designed for soils with a pH of 7.6 and above. It's for alkaline soils. You shouldn't use Olsen test in acid soils. Should use coal, or I prefer Malic 3. So I got this person to send a sample off to EAL, and I gave them a recommendation, and they said thanks. And then about 18 months later, I was doing a soil workshop up at Moruya, and at the first break, this person came up and introduced themselves. And I said, "Oh, you're the veggie grower from Wangaratta?" And they said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, this is a long way to come for a workshop." And they said, "Yeah, well, we did what you said, and we were just astounded with the results." They said we had to put on extra staff to harvest because everything just kept on growing and growing. But they said most amazing thing to us was that every summer they would have grasshopper plagues come through, and they would lose 40% of their leaf crops to insect damage.
Mm-hmm.
And in my early email conversation, I said, if you do this, the grasshoppers won't bother your crop.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They said that summer the grasshoppers came and the grasshoppers left, and we've never lost a single leaf.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, oh, good. So they'd come to the soil workshop. So they got an amazing result. And the garlic was twice the size. It all worked. They'd said in an email initially that they were growing garlic. And I said, well, if you're growing garlic, you've got to get sulfur and boron where it's got to be to grow good garlic. Because sulfur puts size into the bulb and it gives it quality and flavour. And sure enough, they grew this great crop of garlic. So that was the same recipe I give for grass. And grass responds the same way.
So,
and it makes sense because all organisms are related. We all have the same dietary needs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you go.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. There's a couple of points, I suppose. One is, I've got here a note to talk about Hiro Restrepo. I don't know if you've come across Hiro's work.
I haven't, no.
Yeah. Hiro is a Colombian agronomist. He wrote a book, which I'll see if I can get you a copy. I'd love your opinion on it. It's called The ABC of Organic Agriculture. And I think there's a lot of parallels between what you're talking about and what he talks about. I met Hiro. I was invited to Mexico in about 2008, I think it was, by a guy called Eugenio Gras. And Eugenio,
yes, I know of him. Yep.
Yeah. So Eugenio is a student of Hiro, and anyway, I got down there. I was doing the carbon farming series and carbon economy series of courses in the United States. And so that particular program, I had Kirk Gadzia doing holistic management. I had me doing farm planning, water management, etc. I had Elaine Ingham doing soil biology, and I had Joel Salatin doing the sort of, this is how you market, the value chain stuff. And so we had that going around the United States, and I also took it to Europe, and ultimately it became, in 2010, I had that come to Australia in the guise of Regen Ag, and we had the Regen Ag workshop series. Anyway, I get down to Mexico, and Eugenio gets me down there, and I said, oh, this is what I'm up to, blah, blah. He goes, I said, so what do you think about the Elaine Ingham stuff? And he says, oh, yes, we love it. However, it's not campesino friendly. And you touched on one of the reasons why before is that, well, one, the apparatus is expensive for a peasant farmer, and two, they don't have power. So, you
can stand there blowing down a pipe.
Well, A, they can't spend $3,000 or $4,000 on the componentry, because that's like their annual wage, if they're lucky. And B, they just don't have a power line that's going to be able to power that. If they do, it's for 2 hours a day sort of thing. So anyway, I said, oh, so good. So what do you guys do? And he said, well, we do all of this biofertilizer stuff. And I said, oh, right. And so as you probably do the same, I think, I said, all right, well, let's unpack that a bit and tell me what the history of it was and all of that. So he talked about two gentlemen. One is Sebastião Pinheiro, who's a Brazilian agronomist, and Hiro Restrepo, who's from Colombia and also an agronomist. And both of those guys had trained conventionally and then become organic. And their big thing is, well, I shouldn't say their big thing. Their thing is to put the power back, put the agronomic power back in the hands of the producer, and do it in a way that you don't create all of these dependencies, whether it's on a consultant or the usual marriage that we have in agriculture right now, be it organic or be it conventional, is you've got an agronomist and you've got a supplier. All right.
Yep.
You've got a fertilizer supplier and you've got an agronomist who does the interpretation and does your recipes for you.
Yes.
They spend a fair bit of time working with producers using a variety of techniques where, yes, you still get stuff from suppliers, but you also get stuff from your scrap, like those bones, like that rock dust, like this, using different plants, using microbes, doing anaerobic fermentations in particular, similar to what they do in EM, similar to what they do in Korean natural farming, etc., those sorts of methodologies. And of course, using crops as well to provide nitrogen, because, instead of using urea, using nitrogen, which I'll park that for a minute because I want to come back to that. But one of the things, so it for me, it was like, it's how you've probably been through this yourself. You get to where you think you're actually going along okay, and then you open up a window and go, oh my God.
Yes.
I was just feeling
so. The more you know you don't know.
Exactly. Well, it was one of those windows, and going out and working with the producers that they'd worked with and so on. It was astounding. It was absolutely astounding work. But one of the things that they'd talked a lot about was a phenomena called trophobiosis, which is, I think, when you talked about that veggie grower at Wangaratta, that the animal, that the bug, the grasshoppers weren't eating their crop. Well, they'd found exactly that, and there's actually a phenomena which they call trophobiosis, in that a healthy plant or a healthy organism resists disease. It's not a good host for disease, and it's just it's not the vessel for it, and so it resists all forms of malady. So it was interesting for you to bring that up. But just going back to them, in terms of you and your philosophy of dependence, how do you, because again, that comes back to a sort of a sustainability thing. Is Bruce the apex character in this role play? We take Bruce out. How are we as a producer? What sort of, how do you philosophically manage that?
Yeah, well, that's why I teach soils, and I teach everyone to do it themselves. I work as a consultant to a system, but I'd much rather they did it themselves.
Yeah,
and then, because I'm 67, I'm not going to be around for another 50 years. People, you need to be able to do it yourself. But I think, as far as I see it, the idea is we need to understand that if we manage the land in the state it's in as intensively as we like, the high probability it will stay in the state it's in. If we lift the fertility of the soil and then apply the same management, one way or another, and get it to a higher level of production and maintain it at that high level. It's very good for an income stream, and it's very good for the environment. We just have to learn how to lift the fertility to that level as quickly as possible and economically as we can do it. Not many people want to go down a road of soil restoration that's going to take them 20 years. It's not very exciting. But when you see it happening really rapidly, that's very, very encouraging to continue. And I find people are really get enthusiastic when they get results, because most people have trialed all sorts of things. I've put multiple tens of thousands of dollars for chasing rainbows, I call it. All of these people's ideas of, this is all you need. You only need nut compost. You only need X, Y, Z. There's no standalone miracle system. And I've gone down the anaerobic fermentation, fish, sea urchins, all sorts of stuff I've fermented, and All of those things work, but you've got to, when you come back to the chemistry, the quantity of chemistry required to restore the land, those things are a band-aid. And if you really want real results, you've got to lift the chemistry up to where it needs to be to support the type and biomass of organisms that you need to have a fertile landscape. And then you've got to learn how to manage to maintain that if you don't want to be continually putting it on. That's a decision you make. If you learn the skills of maintaining that, then you've got to set up a feedback where you don't need to continually put on, and the sustainability of it is then managed by how much you actually extract from the system. Something that came to mind when you were talking about anaerobic production, well, two things. One is all of these systems that people have come up with of making biofertilizers, etc. All they're doing is producing some chemistry to put into the soil.
Yeah, soluble chemistry.
In our fortunate situation, and we're in a highly developed society, we can go to the shop and buy it and put it on. It's all the same. All of the nutrients plants consume, even in a completely natural system, they're all synthetic. And people are bang on about synthetic fertilizers. Photosynthesis is synthetic. The production of ATP by a cell for energy is a synthetic process. The nutrients that come to plants have all been through synthesis. The products we produce in a bag are in the same form that nature produces. We just have worked out how to do it in a factory. So we can assist nature and fast forward restoration of fertility, or fast forward repair of the damage that we've done. But we have to use it correctly. That is the key. If we don't, we get a really bad result. And then the product gets the blame, just like the livestock get the blame for degrading the land because somebody managed them badly. The other thing I was going to, back to the soil itself. We know soil as a whole has got to be anaerobic, and Elaine has a dislike of, I beg your pardon, has to be aerobic. Elaine has a dislike of anaerobes. She says a few are okay, but you don't want many. Well, the Russian Academy of Science did some research in the mid to late 1930s, and it was in collaboration with about 6 other countries, including the US and UK and about 3 or 4 countries in Europe. And they were looking at, soil, what makes up a good soil. And they concluded that one of their conclusions was you cannot, the formation of new soil and the building of soil structure does not take place in the absence of anaerobes. If there's no anaerobes in the equation, that doesn't happen. So when you look at a well-structured soil now, that's got really good aggregates, those aggregates are anaerobic. They're not aerobic. The surrounding atmosphere in the soil is aerobic, but the inside of those aggregates, it's anaerobic because there's so much life in there that consume a large quantity of the oxygen, and it's predominantly anaerobic organisms, and that's what makes soil structure.
And some of them are phototrophs.
Yes. So the environment, like people, there's great discussion on the rise of atmospheric CO2. The soil atmosphere, the level of CO2 in soil is between 1,000 and 2,000 parts per million. That's in a well-functioning soil, that is the soil atmosphere. And much of the CO2 taken in by plants is actually recycled from the soil. That CO2 diffuses up through the soil, so the level of atmospheric CO2 just above ground level and bathing the grass plants has very much higher CO2 than the further up in the atmosphere, because and then they're taking that in and recycling it. So a lot of the CO2 taken in from plants doesn't come from the atmosphere, it's just being recycled from the soil. So the soil's quite happy with high CO2 and all the organisms in there. So aerobes in soil are really important, is the point I was wanting to get to.
And anaerobes.
We shouldn't think... anaerobes, yeah.
Yeah.
Anaerobes are really important.
Yeah.
And the majority of nitrogen production in soil is produced by anaerobes, not aerobes. Ciliate protozoa is the other front row forward that's going around chewing up bacteria and spitting out all the nitrogen they don't want. They're a major nitrogen producer. They're anaerobes.
Mm.
So we shouldn't have this strong focus on it's all got to be aerobic. I mean, the whole system has to be dominated by, or it has to be aerobic, but anaerobes play an essential role.
Well, it comes back to your whole point, I suppose. Your whole thesis is that it's all about having the right players, about having the right chemistry and having the right players to facilitate and facultate all of that chemistry.
Exactly. Yeah. It's all about balance, balance and quantity. If you get the balance and quantity of chemistry right, the biology just falls into place, because that's what they want too.
Yeah.
And whether the biology is a plant or a microbe, they all have the same balance and quantitative requirement. So chemistry precedes biology, period. You get the chemistry right, and the biology falls into place.
Well, there was a great little triangle diagram in Gary Zimmer's The Biological Farmer that I really liked, where it looked at, and I've used this, it sort of ticked the box for me visually, because it had chemistry, biology and physics together.
Yes.
And I thought, well, and with water being the fluid mass that sort of connects, it's that connects the three, if you like, the three sides, because if your chemistry's wrong, then that's going to affect the physics, as it is going to affect the
biology.
But it largely does that when it's moist. So if you've got a lot of moisture in soil, which is where the calcium's low and the magnesium's high, well, and it's going to have particular physical outcomes as well as particular biological outcomes. So from me, in the way I look at soils both geotechnically and I look at them agronomically. And the geotechnical space is all about, is mostly about soil physical ability. Whereas the agronomic is basically the relationship between chemistry. Well, I won't say absolutely, but it's more about the connection between the biology and the chemistry than it is within a physical whole. Whereas when we're using soils for their geotechnical properties, well, we're not worried about the biology, because it's more of a chemical physical relationship. Because we're using it to make, whether it's to make a mud brick or a road or a dam or a house foundation, it's a different circumstance. We've only got about 10 minutes left. I wanted to, just in terms of urea replacement, people who say that are certified organic and urea is not an allowable input for them, or people who just have a predilection to not using these sorts of amendments. What would your advice, or what's your general advice as far as replacements for that sort of material?
Yeah, well, you can get hold of fertilizers made from grain, like meals that have a good level of nutrients in them. And that they're not overly expensive. And
so if you want nutrients, NPK, but particularly
chemistry, and if you get it from a grain, say a meal, canola meal, I think I've seen has got reasonably good levels of NP and K. You also get a balance of all of the micronutrients. So it's a really good balanced fertilizer for an organic system. And when you look at the cost of micronutrients, it's actually not expensive.
No.
If you want to really pump up the N, you can make foliar N applications out of plants like comfrey. Grow a crop of comfrey and infuse it in water and then spray that on. Comfrey's about 8% N.
Yeah, so it's high. And what
there are
about
other plants,
what about growing crops such as, most people would talk about growing a clover crop or something like that. How do you sort of value that, or is that all fundamentally based on cultivation?
Growing a clover crop for nitrogen, that's a really valid subject, because just because you've got clover doesn't mean you're fixing nitrogen. If you haven't got the chemistry right in the soil, properly balanced, then the clover will grow, but it won't fix nitrogen. It'll have tiny little nodules on it that will be white inside. It's not actively fixing nitrogen. So if you want to grow clover to produce nitrogen biologically, well, you've got to get the chemistry right first to maximize nitrogen production. People look at nodules on a legume and think that that's a nodule of nitrogen. Well, it's not. It's a colony of rhizobium bacteria, which contains 17% nitrogen. And you want to be able to grow that really, really efficiently. That requires the right chemistry for the plant. DPI did a research project a couple of years ago around New South Wales, and they found 85% of legumes were not fixing nitrogen efficiently, and some of them not fixing nitrogen at all. And they concluded that was because the fertility wasn't correct to support the fixation of nitrogen. So the microbes need the nutrient as well as the plant. So in an organic crop, if you've got a mineral imbalance and your crop's not growing well, then growing a legume may not fix the deficiency of N. Whereas if you buy something like a meal and put it on, you know what you're putting on, and it's going to be there.
Or some of the manures as well, I suppose, particularly poultry manure.
Yeah, well, some of the manures, yeah. One of the things I've found with working with organic growers is they think compost and manure is great, which it is, and they think more is better.
Yeah.
And I've had several send me soil tests and say, we're having real production problems. And I look at the soil test and I just email and say, you've overused compost and you've overused manure, because they make these composts and put manure in them, and then they put manure on as well, and they'll have phosphorus levels over 1,000 parts per million. And at that level, they're not going to grow anything. And one of them, I've had two that have been really, really high in phosphorus, and I've said to them, well, you've got to find some more land. Just stop growing in that land. You've killed it with kindness, and phosphorus doesn't easily leach. You've got to physically grow it out. And when it's that high, the plant can't get it. So how do you grow it out? So one of them was in a financial bind, and we come up with a pea foliar application recipe. And as soon as we did that, his crop started growing again because it was suffering from pea deficiency. Got him through that season, and then he acquired some more land. So using manures and compost, etc., both fabulous products, but you've got to monitor your soil chemistry to make sure you don't overdo it, because more is not better. No. It's exactly the same as the old moron statement. More on compost and more on manure is not good. You've got to know what you're doing, because you're just applying chemistry.
So in some ways too, like if you're going to apply that approach where you're going to use these amendments which you don't know the analysis of, you still have to go and do the cost. You have to spend money on the analysis if you're actually going to use it properly. So it may be somewhat of a false economy by the time you get that testing done.
Well, yeah. I tell people who want organic growers who want to use compost and they want to learn how to make compost, I said, before you put the materials together to make a compost heap, first thing you got to do is go and do a soil test of the soil where you're going to use the compost, because that test will tell you how to make the compost. And then you can tailor the compost to suit that soil. All composts are not created equal. And you can tailor the outcome to suit your soil. And then you're unlikely to make a mistake.
Yeah. Well, this has been a really fascinating chat today, and I really appreciate you giving up your morning or part thereof this morning
Yep.
to have it with me. It's been I've personally, as some of my students would know, I've been in a sort of a mixed space because the gods haven't been right for me, and
Yep.
and I've just been looking at it from a bang for buck point of view, very holistically, and from a sustainability
Yep.
point of view. And it's been a difficult period for me personally from that perspective, to feel like, because it's a very noisy space, and I've sort of come down. Sort of like, it's probably been incorrect of me to retreat perhaps as far as I have from the space, because I just haven't, outside of people like Hyro Estrepo and those sorts of characters, I've found it really difficult to sort of enter back into it in the way that I would have liked to, because I do like analysis and I understand that, and I never sort of retreated from that, but I just thought, in terms of the bang for the buck for people and the continual creation of dependency, all of that sort of stuff that really irks me, there haven't been too many answers on that front, and I'm really refreshed to have had the chat with you today, Bruce, because it's sort of brought me back a bit. You've had a good bit of bait. You might have thrown a bit of burley in there earlier, but I'm feeling a lot better about it now. So thank you.
One thing I'd like to say, great. If we've just got a minute or two, one thing I'd like to say is that people make statements because of the methodology of their production that they're growing nutrient-dense food, and typically it comes from organic growers.
Yes.
And the statement's made purely because of methodology. They don't actually know that.
No.
If you haven't tested the nutrient content of your food, you're leading yourself astray. I did a workshop for a group of organic horticulturalists, and I knew one of them who was doing a really good job of an organic vegetable, as an organic vegetable grower. Well, I thought they were. I went and before the workshop, I went and got a sample of one of their crops, silver beet. Same day I went to the supermarket, bought a conventional one, sent them both to the lab for a mineral analysis. I put them up on the screen when we were doing the workshop, and I said, which one would you eat? They were both very similar, except the conventional one was slightly higher in nutrients. It was better than the organic one. And they were quite gobsmacked. I said, well, the conventional grower understands the chemistry that's required. The difference, of course, is that the organic one we know has got no agrochemicals applied to it, and that takes precedence over minerals, in my opinion.
Yes.
But just because it's organic doesn't mean it's nutrient dense.
Yeah, and if you
don't test it, you don't know.
Yeah, that was a big point that Neil Kinsey. I got that as a big takeaway when I did my training with Neil 15 or so years ago. So I understood that very well. Well, again, thank you so much.
Okay.
Thanks to Heidi for lending it to us this morning, and and for her support.
Yep.
And bravo to you for going on the journey that you have. I didn't even get to talk to you about your fencing, because I perhaps came to you. I came to you vicariously as an admirer of your fencing, without knowing that you're some sort of soil genius. So, but I'm really
flattery will get you everywhere.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's what my wife says. So thank you so much for joining me and all of us. And
my pleasure.
I've put some links to your website on there. It'd be really great to have another chat with you another time. So Soilsmith.a.
The website's not functioning at present.
Oh, well,
you wouldn't think our
you don't need it to, but nonetheless,
we don't use it anymore.
Yeah, it'd be
so we
it'd
sort
be
of
great
haven't
to have more of a chat about your program and how that works at the stage. So we might go into this conversation a bit deeper.
That'd be a good conversation. Yeah, because I've put the views of a whole pile of scientists together and researchers to come up with what is the optimum level of nutrition for plants, and it changes as CEC changes. And I've tested it, and the plants really agree with what I've put together.
No,
So that's my ultimate test of whether or not it's right.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, bravo.
So that
to
would
you,
be
sir.
a good conversation.
Yeah, bravo.
Yep. Thank you very much, Darren.
No worries at all, mate.
Catch you later.
Lovely to chat. All right. Take care. Hooroo.
Yep. Catch you later. Go well.
Thank you. You too.